The modern Gordian knot, who will have the glory? A once great Roman statesman by the name of Cicero had long ago said, quote, "Who does not know that the first law of historical writing is the truth?" End quote. As a classical historian amongst many, the idea behind this quote holds true to many in political discussions. But in today's society, with a world wrapped in rhetoric both good and bad, what determines truth behind history? This sort of question is at the forefront of scholarly discussion and can be seen very vividly when it comes to the modern debate over Alexander the Great and Macedonia. In a fierce 20-year struggle against each other, the two countries of Greece and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia have been fighting a battle of words against each other to protect what seems to be theirs historically. Both not only claim that Macedonia in all its glory is their own, but that also, with it, Alexander the Great is theirs too. This is a controversy that has yet to have been resolved, and with it has brought about social and political turmoil for each side of the aisle, including myself as a Greek American who values this area of history. More significantly, though, the two countries' persistence on the issue has indirectly jeopardized the truth behind this portion of classical history. With the twisting of facts, lack of context across the board, and downright ignorance, Alexander the Great and the glory of Macedonia have become in danger of being skewed. This unfortunate effect has in some ways opened the door to greater skepticism about twisting historical fact. Considering this concept, one must ask whether either side has rightful ownership of Alexander and Macedonia, or do each simply argue with no possible end? As both a political and historical debate, the issue over Alexander the Great and Macedonia can become quite skewed without the proper context of events. As explained in the work of Viktor Rudimentov, this controversy all began in 1991 when Yugoslavia broke up into smaller independent countries. Of these newly established countries at the time, one that formed in the far south of the former Yugoslavia was that of the People's Republic of Macedonia. Historically, Macedonia was the classical state that Alexander the Great was from and also ruled over in the 4th century BCE, so the creation of Macedonia in modernity began a debate over history. In addition, the newly formed country's decision to name itself Macedonia created a border dispute with Greece because the area of northern Greece below the People's Republic of Macedonia was already called Macedonia. This border clash gave way to the idea that in Greece, the Republic of Macedonia was going to try to make land claims on Greek land in the distant future. Without getting into the history of the pre-World War I Balkans, the Republic of Macedonia took a different route from land claims and began to adopt history for the newly created country. As an example, quote, in 1977, Greek archaeologists discovered the ancient Macedonian Virgina star symbol in Greek Macedonia inside a royal burial chamber, end quote. In 1992, this symbol had been adopted by the People's Republic of Macedonia as the centerpiece of their flag. Being a provocative move, this is just one example of the many measures the People's Republic of Macedonia took to adopt history and formulate an identity. Nevertheless, within a few short years, the People's Republic of Macedonia began to embody the Macedonian past through the construction of statues of Alexander and the naming of modern sites after Macedonian figures from the past. All these moves on the behalf of the People's Republic of Macedonia has resulted in the modern controversy today over who has claimed Alexander and Macedonia. When discussing the controversy about Alexander the Great and ancient Macedonia, the issue easily becomes two-pronged. The first aspect of this controversy is territorial in nature as a result of supposed dominion of Macedonia. In order for the secondary historical aspect to make complete sense, one must look at the side which started the controversial territorial aspect and their defense of it. The modern-day country, formerly known as the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, or FYROM for short, was given the name Macedonia by the previous ruling Yugoslavian dictator Tito. According to Danforth, quote, Tito, Yugoslavia's post-war communist leader, who in 1944 baptized a mosaic of nationalities, who were Albanians, Serbs, Turks, Blacks, Greeks, and Gypsies, with no justification at all, gave them the name Macedonians. Tito took a geographical term and used it to name a new nationality. Until that point, Macedonia was neither a nation nor state. Macedonia by itself was merely the name of a region from Roman times, which in the 1990s had spanned multiple countries later. In fact, the region itself was something of a prize, and upon Ottoman relinquishment, the First Balkan War began over it. This point in time is where the modern state of Greece won and obtained the majority of what was Central Macedonia, or also known as the ancient portion. Nevertheless, because Macedonia didn't exist as a nation entity and was rather a multiple country region, there was nothing wrong in the eyes of Tito over creating an official Macedonia, and deeming the people within as Macedonian de facto. Back then, Macedonia was a term given to a collective group of people searching for an identity, like many within the Balkans. As a peaceful notion, this argument still stands within Fyrom today, but unfortunately overlooks Greek Macedonians in Greece, creating its flaw. On the contrary, in Greece, the country which claims that it is most associated with Macedonia in history argues differently from Fyrom. Rather than focusing on the words of the post-Yugoslavian dictator Tito, Greece dives back further in time to support their ownership of Macedonia as a territory. As a brief example, according to historian Agelarchus et al., quote, "The land in question, with its modern capital at Skopje, which is Fyrom, was called Paeonia in antiquity. Mount Barnus and Orbelos provide a natural barrier that separated and separates Macedonia from its northern neighbor." End quote. As can be seen by this quote, ancient Macedonia had resided south of the two mentioned mountains. The portion north of it was called Paeonia, which was eventually assimilated into Macedonia in classical times. Today, the portion that is south of those mountains belongs to Greece and is still called Macedonia. Without diving into the history of ancient Macedonia, modern Fyrom doesn't have a foot to stand on territorially through the eyes of Greece. For Greece, though, Macedonia has always been located south of those two mountains. The credibility of that statement comes from the words of the Roman Livy. Through analyzing Livy as a source, it can be noted that he was a Roman historian who had commentated on the subdivisions of the greater Macedonian province established by Rome. In other words, Livy looked at the newly created province of Macedonia as established by Rome in his time, and broke it down into previous subdivisions that had existed when Greece was still independent. Because of this fact, Greece looks towards ancient historians to justify their means of Macedonian ownership today. This practice by Greece is problematic in some regards because certain figures such as Livy are skeptical sources. For example, according to Steele, quote, "The value of the history of Livy is not so much in its portrayal of preceding ages as in its reflection of the thought of the Romans at the time he wrote. We may say that their supposed historical facts were fancies, yet these fancies were the sure mental facts for the age of Livy." End quote. Information such as the previous does not mean that ancient scholars like Livy are incorrect. It just means that they are skeptical as sources when it comes to arguments such as the one over Macedonia. It is wise to note that through using history, Greece doesn't just cite classical scholars. In addition, she looks towards other figures in history to support her stance on the matter. Some of these other scholars in time are typically cited from the Byzantine era, Romanticized era, and pre-World War I era. Nevertheless, just how Fyrom has a flaw in her argument, Greece is sometimes criticized too for citing sources from a pre-modern Greek state in order to justify a modern Greek state. With just barely glancing over the territorial aspect of the Alexander and Macedonian controversy, the other half of this two-pronged issue is that over ownership of Alexander the Great and the subsequent history of ancient to post-Macedonia itself. Like the territorial aspect, the debacle over Alexander the Great ownership started with Fyrom as the instigator. Following the creation of the People's Republic of Macedonia in 1991, the country set forth a campaign to lay claim to Macedonian history as mentioned before. It is internationally known that Fyrom claims they are Macedonian in the ancient sense of the word, and that they believe Alexander the Great is theirs historically. Their defense of such claims comes heavily from the reliance of ancient texts from Plutarch and Quintus Curtius Rufus. This in many ways is similar to that of Greece's use of ancient sources to back up their claims. According to James Pettifer, quote, "Slav scholars usually concentrate their arguments on the passage in Plutarch where the ancient historian describes the struggles that took place between Alexander's successors, referring to the troops as shouting in Macedonian. The Slavists usually conclude that this shows the existence of an autochthonous Macedonian people who were colonized by a Greek-speaking ruling class, and so on." End quote. Evidence behind this quote gives Fyrom the idea that Macedonian as an identity, language, and culture is separate from that of Greek. Because Alexander the Great was a Macedonian, they also argue that he belongs to them by these same means. Another example can be seen in the History of Macedonia by the Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus. Quote, "After all, he," and by he, Philip II, father of Alexander, "thoroughly destroyed Thebes. Therefore his empire is correctly called Macedonian, not Greek, for he won it with an army of 35,000 Macedonians and only 7,600 Greeks." End quote. Like the previous quote, this one also expresses how Macedonians and Greeks are two separate entities in the viewpoint of Pharom. This sort of ancient text gives Pharom the idea that Alexander the Great and the history of Macedonia are separate from that of Greeks/Greece's. While this may or may not be true, one point of criticism that comes from the opposition is why this country believes that the history is theirs. Macedonian history may be separate from that of the Greeks in the context of the quotes, but what gives Pharom the right to be claimant as Macedonian? On the flip side of the coin, within this controversy, Greece argues that it rightfully has claim to Alexander the Great and subsequent Macedonian history. Their argument in this aspect of the issue is very similar to that of Pharom's. Greece looks towards ancient texts to prove that Alexander the Great is Macedonian, but only in the Greek regard. As an example, Aubrey de Selincourt quotes the ancient Roman historian Orion, quote, "There are Greek troops, to be sure, in Persian service, but how different is their cause from ours? They will be fighting for pay, and not much of it at that. We, on the contrary, shall fight for Greece, and our hearts will be in it." End quote. According to Orion, these were the exact words of Alexander himself. Those on the Greek side of the controversy argue that information such as what was provided proves that Alexander the Great is Greek, by stating information such as how different is their cause from ours. In reference to other Greeks, Alexander implies that he is Greek. In addition, by stating that we on the contrary shall fight for Greece, implies that Alexander is one with Greece itself. Furthermore, those on the Greek side of the argument will dive deeper back into the roots of Alexander to prove that he is Greek. Another example of how Alexander the Great is Greek, according to the Greek side of the aisle, can be seen when discussing Alexander's own mother. Elizabeth Carney, in her work on Alexander's mother, states, quote, "Olympias was born the daughter of Neoptolemus, king of Molosia, a region of Epirus." End quote. The Molossians were a Greek tribe that lived within Epirus. Epirus is a region of both classical and modern-day Greece. Essentially, all this shows that Alexander the Great had a Greek mother, meaning that he, as a historical figure, was also Greek. Many on the Greek side of the controversy will cite a fact such as this to furthermore show how Alexander the Great is Macedonian by Greek standards and not that of Phaerom's. Although, like Phaerom, the flaw in Greece's argument here comes from the credibility of the sources. Much of what has been shown has come from Roman scholars who existed hundreds of years after that of Alexander. After seeing both the Phaerom side and the Greek side of the controversy, it is worth mentioning that there is a third side to the entire debacle. The third side consists of a fraction of the scholarly community who has taken what appears to be the neutral stance. Without picking Phaerom or Greece for their arguments, this side argues for history alone and the importance of not slandering it. As an example of a stance from this side, Andreas Willi in her work argues, quote, "Unless one subscribes to a dangerous blood and soil ideology, there is no reason why the modern Slavic Macedonians should not be allowed to continue to call their country Macedonia, and to pride themselves in Alexander the Great just as much as the modern Hellenic Greeks do. What does it matter if Alexander the Great was Greek, not Slavic, as long as no one claims the opposite?" End quote. Looking at this one example, those on the third side of the controversy argue not for either side, but for reason between the two. From the portion of the quote that states, "What does it matter if Alexander was Greek, not Slavic, as long as no one claims the opposite?" It can be seen that this neutral ground does not pick sides. Rather, more importantly, this side addresses facts for what they are and argues to maintain what is historically true. Neither the Greek nor Phaerom side of the controversy makes sense to them. In fact, most find the broader argument trivial. Overall, it can be seen that the ownership issue over Alexander the Great in Macedonia is quite extensive. With just barely scratching the surface of the controversy, it remains to be seen whether one side has enough justification to claim Alexander in Macedonia. What can be said, though, is each side of the argument has its strong points. As a Greek-American classics student, I have my biases, and while I might not agree with the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia's actions for trying to claim history, I can respect their desire for an identity. In fact, as long as history isn't distorted, I see their choice in an identity as a tribute to that part of the past itself. On the other side of the coin, though, I find the argument of Greece to be that of the stronger one, despite some questionability behind their ancient sources. In my opinion, when reading about Alexander the Great, it is hard to say that he wasn't Greek. Not only did he fight for the glory that was Greece, but he spread Greek culture all over the known world. If that doesn't make him Greek, then I'm not sure what does for anyone. Nevertheless, I believe strongly in the preservation of history. Whether this controversy has an end or not, it is most important that the world knows who Alexander the Great was and what he did, not the debate that followed him. His accomplishments paved the way for the world we live in today, and whether Greek Macedonian or Fyrom Macedonian, that is something we can all be proud of.